Working Cows Podcast, episode 145.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, here with another episode for you, powered by the Global Ag Network, and I'm excited to welcome Jim Gerrish back to the show. Of course, Jim Gerrish is a renowned grazer and educator, traveling all over and doing a lot of investing in the grazing community, so really glad to have him back on the Working Cows Podcast. It's been a long time. Proof, again, that we need more agricultural podcasts, more people interviewing people like Jim. So if you're out there and you're on the fence about starting one, I would love to help you get started. But for now, let's welcome Jim to the show. Jim, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Happy to do it, Clay.
I had somebody track me down one time and said, you know, I've been listening to your podcast, and I have been sitting up late at night rocking a new baby and wondering, while I listen to your podcast, how do I get started? And so kind of their mode right now is to turn out a certain number of pairs into a large pasture and let them have at that pasture until, you know, the end of a certain date on the calendar. And so it's I think 3, 4, maybe 5 months at a time. All those pairs are turned out into that one pasture, and as I understand it, it's the same pasture every year. So I guess with the episode title of Introducing More and Proper Rest, in a situation like that, where do you get started?
You get started really with the first fence you put in. Now, you can take that big field where they are for 4 or 5 months, split it in half, and you could do some different things. You could graze the front half for 2.5 months, and then the back half 2.5 months. And what you would have is 2 episodes of continuous grazing with all its negativities, which, you know, we could talk about for a long time, but I think most of your listeners probably have some idea. Or you could move them back and forth every day. Hey, I move my cows every day. Yeah, but it's from one pasture to the other pasture. And all you have then is ongoing episodes of continuous grazing on alternate days. Or you could do something like have them on an area for 3 or 4 weeks, move them to the other side for 3 or 4 weeks, and switch them back and forth like that. And you would actually derive a little bit of benefit from doing that in terms of allowing some recovery. It probably helps some species diversity. You'd grow a little more grass in the year, but the marginal increase that you would get from doing that is pretty small. So we could split the pasture again and have 4 pastures to work with. And for a long time, especially on rangelands in the West, 3 or 4 pasture rotations were a pretty common thing. And that might be, if in a particular area you have a grazing season for 4 months, which is because we live in a public land state, very often that's all the grazing season might be, is just 4 months. And so if you had 4 pastures, you'd be on this pasture for a month, and then it would be allowed to recover for 3 months, the remainder of the growing season. And then you go to another one of the pastures. And the key thing to making that work is every year you change the sequence in which you use those pastures. And that has contributed to some range improvements and a little healthier plant communities in a rangeland environment. Now, if you're in a productive environment where we've got a 200-day growing season, it rains 30, 40 inches every year, with 4 pastures, man, it is hard to juggle the rotation in that, because we do talk about, you know, one of the old adages of rotational grazing was fast growth, fast rotation, slow growth, slow rotation. So even that very old idea indicates that you have to have flexibility. You have to be able to adjust the length of the grazing period, the length of the recovery period. And with 4 pastures, you don't have a whole lot of flexibility. Yes, you can make progress, you can gain some improvement, but if we talk about marginal responses, increases in carrying capacity or productivity, we might be talking 10 to 15% there. We split that pasture again, and now we have 8 opportunity for 8 controlled grazing periods rather than just 4, and we can split it into go 6 and have 16. And so what you see, and a lot of people still only see that we are splitting the land into smaller and smaller spaces. But what we're really doing is creating smaller and smaller increments of time. And it is the management of time, both the duration of the grazing period itself and then the length of recovery period that we allow. It is that management of time that gives us the dramatic increases in productivity and carrying capacity. When I left the university 17 years ago, after 20 plus years in research, I was confident that we could achieve 20 to 40% increases in carrying capacity with planned grazing over what was happening with set stocking, 20 to 40%. And that's worthwhile. That's significant. That's worth doing. After being in private business for 10 years, doing grazing management myself, working with clients in lots of different environments across the US, Canada, and now around the world, I became more confident that, we could easily see 50 or more percent increase in carrying capacity. And now we routinely plan projects with the expectation that we are going to double the carrying capacity on that ranch. So that's 100% increase. And the way we've gone from this idea of, we can get 20 to 40% to, we can do better than 50%, now thinking we can do 100%. And our very best success story on a 4-section grazing unit, so 2,600 acres, was 400% increase in carrying capacity on it. And it all has come to a better understanding that it is time that we are managing, not just the space. We are managing increments of time. And that is how you get to this place of easily doubling the carrying capacity on almost any property.
And can you define for me more and proper rest, more and proper recovery? Let's start with the more recovery. Is there a point at which the labor it takes to get more recovery isn't worth the return on investment, so to speak?
There is a point. With everything, almost every response is a diminishing returns response. So yes, there is some point you will get to that additional inputs of labor, infrastructure development may no longer be paying their way. And that really depends on the productivity of the environment, at what point that takes place. We have looked at implementing MIG in some pretty tough range country. And by pretty tough range country, I'm talking about where the base productivity is only 5 to 6 animal unit days per acre harvested. For those of your listeners who aren't that familiar with animal unit days, all an animal unit day is 26 pounds of dry matter forage harvested. So I'm talking about environments where the amount of forage that we can, in good conscience, harvest from the range plants out there on a per acre basis is only 120 to 150 pounds of dry matter per acre. And if you make a 50% increase in carrying capacity on a property that is only producing 6 AUDs per acre, and you go up to 9, oh, that's a 50% increase in productivity. But 3 additional animal unit days per acre, what their value is, because every animal unit day has a gross value to it, and it has a gross margin return value to it. So at that level, you can't pay for very much infrastructure, very much labor, if the return is only 3 animal unit days per acre. Now let's go to a somewhat better rangeland environment that has the potential of 30 AUDs per acre. And through our installation of infrastructure and our grazing management, we get 50, and we're still going to get that 50% increase. That's 15 additional AUDs per acre. Well, the dollar value of that is much, much better. And you can afford to make some investment in infrastructure and run some additional labor. Now let's look at a productive environment where we have the capacity of 200 animal unit days per acre, and we get a 50% increase. And now we're at 300 animal unit days per acre. That is a tremendous return on investment. So what you can afford to put into infrastructure and labor to extend the recovery period really depends a lot on what the base productivity of the land is. We've done plans for a few projects, as I said, in those low productivity environments, when at the end of the the consultation, what I say to the landowner is, have you considered selling this ranch and moving to Missouri? Because some of these, the ranch might be beautiful. It might be a legacy ranch, or a guy bought it as a trophy ranch or something and decided, he wants it to be a working ranch. There are some that, with our best efforts, we cannot make them pay. The vast majority, though, we can do it. And so the investment, back to your question, was what is the point at which it doesn't make sense to go any further with it? We do cost benefit analysis on most of the projects that we plan. And so we look at what the expected response is going to be and what the cost of the project is. And if we have drawn something out, and just for conversation, I'm going to say that the cost of the fence and water development on this particular project is going to be $100 per acre. If we can't show that being paid off, with some clients it's 3 years, with some it's 5 years, but I don't expense things out over 20 years and say, oh, this will be profitable over the 20 years, because there's two aspects to these things. There is long-term profitability, and there is cash flow reality. And most commercial ranchers and farms, we operate on cash flow reality. And so the time period that we feel like we can expense this project out over is fairly short. I do a lot of 3-year planning. And so if the analysis says we can't pay for this $100 in 3 years' time, we're going to look at changing our strategies, and that might be shifting from some permanent water installations to over-the-surface pipelines, movable water. And we see if we can get that cost down to what we think we can get it paid for in that target window of time, that 3 years that I'm using for an example. And after you do a project like that, and if the land has improved and your production grass growth has increased and you can carry more animals, then there should be some excess cash return coming back in. And so you go to stage 2 of the project. The things that we cut out in the first round, I said we can't afford that right now. But if we make the land more productive, we have the opportunity to do those components of the project later in time.
Sure. And you can buy that over the ground pipe at the size that you're going to bury in the ground and then use that as the buried pipe later.
Exactly. Yeah, like for instance, most of the pipe, the HDP pipe that we sell, I believe, has 15-year above ground warranty, 30-year below frost line warranty. And so you might put it out for 5 years and just run it over the surface 5 years. And then in year 6, you start burying it. And it's still going to be a pipe that's going to last many, many years when it does go underground.
Right. So we talked a little bit about more rest or kind of, I think, just getting people thinking down the direction of what is going to be the best return on investment. I think that sometimes is lost, and I appreciate people that have directed me in the way of thinking that way. But could we talk about proper rest? What do you mean by that?
Okay. I used to say rest a lot. I go back to my university days. I always said rest. Got to give the pasture rest. And I have since learned that the term we should be using, and it isn't purely semantics, is recovery. I've had too many people say to me, yeah, I run cows out on that pasture all summer and then I rested over winter. You and me, we might gain some value from rest over the winter. We'll put on weight, be able to withstand the cold better and all that. But recovery, what recovery means is the plant is recovering. It is growing more leaves. It's rebuilding the root system. It is putting carbohydrates into storage for winter survival or post-grazing trauma recovery. Recovery only occurs during the active growing season. That's a key point that people have to realize. And so this is one of the reasons it becomes important to change the pattern of use of your pastures. Because if you have a pasture or set of pastures that is always grazed in October, well, in a big part of the country, there's not much growth after the end of October. So recovery does not actually happen on that pasture. And we would expect if it is repeatedly used in October, that it's going to start being diminished. And particularly those species that are the best grazing in October, those ones will get selectively grazed out. And the species that in years gone by made that a real desirable pasture for use in the fall of the year, well, they've disappeared now due to selective grazing and lack of recovery time. So, but if we take that same pasture and next year we graze it in July, and then maybe in September, and then in June, in subsequent years. And what's really important is, because I spend so much time now in an environment where most of the native pasture, if it's not irrigated, it gets grazed one time a year. And that's it. But if we're talking about an environment where you can run 2 grazing cycles, 3 grazing cycles, 4 grazing cycles, whatever, then the key thing to keep in mind is the last grazing of the year on that paddock should not be occurring on the same day every year. You should have, in a productive environment, you should have a month's leeway at which you end the grazing on that particular pasture. But key takeaway on this is recovery has to happen during the growing season. And, people say, well, how many days does that take? And I pretty well always go back to talking about leaf stage, the number of leaves on a grass tiller. And most grasses, and we talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. If most grasses, if they have, 2 leaves, just 1 or 2 leaves, that's obviously phase 1. The transition from phase 1 to phase 2 is generally as the plant is moving from 2 leaves to 3 leaves. I think orchard grass could probably be considered to be into phase 2 at, just a little more than 2 leaf average per tiller, 2.5 leaves. Orchard grass is there. There's many grasses that are not there, individual species, until it has 3 leaves. So to me, the minimum recovery is the grass plant has to have the opportunity to grow at least 2 to 3 new leaves before we graze it again or before we go into winter with it. Now, we have to be grazing somewhere in the weeks prior to winter. So we are going to have some pastures that do get grazed off just as we're going into hard winter, the dormant season, and they have no chance for recovery. So the two things that we do is we try not to graze them as severely at that point in the season, and we will make the point that they're going to have at least a month, 6 weeks, 7 weeks of recovery in the spring before they get grazed again.
So that was on the list of things that I wanted to talk about today is how does grass grow? And if there's anything else you want to say about that, I would appreciate that. But I guess since you've already covered part of it, I would say, how does grass respond to grazing? Is there a time when that plant has been bitten that it is kind of in a state of shock, for lack of a better term, where it's not growing, and then after a while it starts to grow again?
Yeah. If a grass plant, and we'll come back and talk about legumes in a little bit. Make sure I said that. Make sure you ask me.
Okay,
what about legumes? What do they fit in here? So when grasses have that fewer than 2 to 3 leaves, when they're in phase one, if they get bitten off, then there's going to be very, very little residual leaf area left behind, because when they're at that early growth stage, there's not enough indigestible fiber in the plant to make it resistant to tearing. So if an animal bites a grass tiller that only has 2 to 3 leaves on, it's probably going to tear it down to, just an itty bitty stem base with no real leaf area. So recovery then has to come from stored carbohydrates, because the initial early phase one up to the beginning of phase two growth, that is largely driven by stored energy. The storage energy has been depleted. There's no residual leaf area, and that's why the plant sits there in that state of shock and is very, very slow to recover. That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. Once the plant gets beyond 3 leaves, we go to 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5 leaves, and some tillers won't ever even get to 5 leaves. There's other species like smooth brome grass on a vegetative tiller. It could have 11 or 12, 13 leaves out there, which is very, very different from how orchard grass, fescue, ryegrass is one that very often by 4 leaves is wanting to put a seed head out. So this is why it does become important to understand what species you do have in your pastures and how they respond differently, because there are nuances. And that's part of when we talk about master grazers. How did they get to that point? Because they actually understand the individual plants that they're working with and will change their grazing strategy at different times of year based on which plants are flourishing at that time. But once we get those plants with 3, 4, 5 leaves on, when the animals take a bite, there is more resistance in the leaves themselves to the tearing off the plant. Now, a lot of folks have the idea that if I say indigestible fiber, oh, you're talking about stems. No, not only stems. Every individual leaf, as it ages, develops more indigestible fiber. That's what allows the leaf, to stand up at a proper angle and capture solar energy. It is structural fiber. So when we get out there to that 3, 4, 5 leaf point and the animals take a single bite, there's going to be residual leaf area left behind. Plus, the plant is going to be in a better stored carbohydrate state at that time. And so we have more rapid recovery taking place. Now, as a plant goes beyond 4 or 5 leaves or does come to the heading point, and that's an important thing to understand. and this applies to pretty well all cool season grasses and a lot of warm season grasses, most warm season grasses. Once the seed head starts to form on that tiller, there is no more new leaf growth. Any new vegetative growth has to come from new tillers, which are either at the base of the plant or on some species, very low leaf axils. And so a tiller that has started the heading process, you can bite that off as severely as you want, and or leave it as tall as you want, and it's not going to make a difference on the productivity of that particular tiller because it's done. What matters at that point is what do we have coming for new tillers at the base of the plant. And what we want to avoid doing when sometimes, pastures get away from us and it's fully headed out and it's mature and know they don't like to eat it. And so we go to very, very high stock densities to force them to eat that stemmy stuff. Well, you know what they do is before they bite that stemmy stuff off, they go down to the base of the plant and bite new growth that's coming on. And if that new growth that's coming on is only 2 leaves per tiller, you've set that whole recovery process in that plant back. It's actually better if that pasture gets away from you, just continue to let it get away from you till that new crop of tillers gets out to the 3-4 leaf stage. Then you can come in at that very high stock density and force them to eat that stemmy stuff, and they'll eat it better at that point because the new growth, that 3-4 leaf stage tiller down there, that has plenty of protein in it that'll feed the rumen bugs that will allow them to digest the stems that were in that first crop. Over the years, I've had better luck letting a pasture get even more mature and away from me and letting the new growth of tillers come in it to keep animal performance up. And then as soon as I've grazed that pasture, I'm off of it and we're getting recovery on that second level of tillers in there.
Sure.
I used to be real obsessive about trying to get all those seed heads, grazed down before they actually started to mature, and found out I may have been shooting myself in the foot doing some of that.
Right, because they're grazing that new growth stuff instead of the
same thing. If you're going to be using hay harvest to manage your feed supply, if you anticipate and this is one of the values of pasture inventorying and knowing where they are, if you can identify earlier what paddocks, what fields you should be cutting for hay to get the old growth off to stimulate the new crop coming. If you can cut that first growth off before when the new tillers are still below cutter bar height, that's the time to do it. What a lot of people end up doing is this pasture's gotten away from me, I'm going to go cut it for hay. And they end up cutting it for hay just as the second wave of tillers is hitting the mower height. And if we still ran, our mowers at 4 to 5 inches high, that it wouldn't be so bad. But when you go out with a disc mower and you're cutting it down at 1.5 inch to 2 inch stubble, which it's amazing. Guys who are good grazers and they understand the value of residual in their grazing paddocks, they still take their disc mower out and clean up those fields down to that 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and they've just knocked the heck out of what should have been their next crop. So you either want to, when you're doing hay harvest, you either want to do it before the second wave of tillers gets to the cutter height, or you want to let that field get a little more mature and let it get out to 3 or 4 leaves
Could you talk a little bit? I guess you told me, first of all, to ask about the legumes, to come back to that.
Okay. What my experience has been is if we take a pasture and with our grazing management, we focus on keeping the grasses in phase 2. So what we like to do is go into a pasture when the grass is fairly high in phase 2, so that's 4 or 5 leaves on it, and let them bite it off, but still leaving a lot of residual leaf area out there. If we focus on managing the grass appropriately, my experience is almost all the legumes, they just come along for the ride. About the only time that I actually focus on the maturity of the legume in grazing is if I have a predominantly alfalfa pasture and a herd that I think might be sensitive to bloating. Then I will pay attention to the legume maturity. But our pastures out here under these pivots, we've got alfalfa, red clover, white clover, outside clover, black medic, a few other odds and ends. And I pretty well focus on the grass stage management, and we can keep legumes in there. Now, we do stockpile. If we can allow a 60 to 75 day recovery period, late summer, early fall, to be growing our fall feed, that's a long enough window of time that any legume in that paddock that we're stockpiling should mature and make seed for stand regeneration.
Sure.
So that's part of the management also, to keep legumes strong, is do allow some natural reseeding periodically.
Right. And that 65 to 70 days, is that kind of irrespective of rainfall, or, I mean, some places have a 45-day growing season. So how does that work in your understanding? Okay.
In an area that has a 45-day growing season, like that would be rangeland with some of our native legumes. The growing season might be 45, 50, 55 days, but the grazing season on it maybe as long as 12 months. Very, very often, it's 4 or 5 months. And so any legume species that is growing in that kind of environment ecologically will be adapted to being able to mature and produce seed on just that 45 to 50 days of growth. It's going to be, probably 65, 70 days following the initiation of spring growth that the seed is mature. But it doesn't, you don't have to have rainfall for the seed to mature. You need rainfall to the point of flowering and pollination. If it doesn't rain another drop after that, you will probably still generate some viable seed.
And that's different for grass then, as far as seed heads. Will they just seed out shorter?
Yeah, very often drought will actually stimulate more heading in a lot of grasses. You might think that, well, if it's dry and they're stressed, they're not going to head as much. The opposite is actually the case, because seed production is a survival strategy. And if the grass plant senses that it's drier than usual, it may produce more seed heads.
Sure. We talked earlier about places where you've kind of said, have you thought about buying something in Missouri? Could you talk about some of the commonalities of ranches where the investment isn't worth it?
Oh, from a production standpoint, there's places out on the plains, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, where you can't see mountains, where there isn't good fishing streams, where land is still priced close to what its ag production potential is. In environments like that, those are affordable places to ranch. I could pick up my computer, point it out the window, and you could look at our spectacular scenery. And scenery, where we are, scenery is what drives the value of a ranch. The elk hunting is what drives the value of the ranch. Do we have a blue ribbon trout stream running through it? Okay. Those are places you do not want to buy if you are mostly interested in ranching. It's a wonderful place to live. It's a great lifestyle. Some of those trophy ranches are, in fact, very profitable commercial ranches for the simple reason that the guy or gal who was wealthy enough to buy it as the trophy was successful in some other kind of business. And so they view ranching as a business, not as a lifestyle tradition. And so they are much more willing to make investments in things that make the ranch more profitable. They are much more willing to have their cows calving in the summertime rather than in the wintertime because it makes sense to do that. And you take someone who is business savvy and explain why it makes sense, biological sense, economic sense, to calve in May and June rather than February and March, and they'll do it. I said, no, yeah, that makes sense. They'll do it that way. So some of these trophy ranches are actually very profitable commercial ranches. Some of these fifth generation traditional lifestyle ranch, they are not profitable because those are the people who most likely are going to be hung up in, this is the way we've always done it. They go broke and they sell it as a trophy ranch. But out on the plains, where the scenery is a little more plain, those are reasonable places to ranch. And the productivity on most of those places is potentially high enough that you can afford the investment in stock water development and fencing to increase the carrying capacity and raise the revenue stream and make them potentially even more profitable.
When you're talking about the commonalities of these ranches where the investment isn't worth it, would you say that it's the value of that land is primarily driving that decision to say maybe somewhere else is a better fit?
Yeah, if you don't have the outside capital to make the initial land investment, if you're looking to buy a ranch to actually be in the cattle business, uglier landscapes are more attractive investments.
Very good. I appreciate that. So let's say we've got an individual who's got a 4,000 acre pasture, just as a round number, and they are looking to change it. You said initially start out by building one fence, resting half, using half, or using one half for 3 weeks, using another half for 3 to 4 weeks. Do you typically start people off with temporary or permanent infrastructure? How are those things typically most profitably done?
Again, it ties back to the productivity, but more and more, we do a lot of combination systems. So you make some major land unit divisions with permanent fence, and then within those work with temporary fence to manage the grazing. And over time, if you find that just repeatedly you're putting that temporary fence in the same spot each time you come there because it makes sense to do that, that's probably a pretty good indication that you just as well put a permanent fence in there. And to be clear, when we're talking permanent fence with cattle in a grazing cell development like this, any interior fence, more and more, we are just talking single high tension, one strand, 12.5 gauge electrified high tensile wire. If you really want to get carried away, you might put up 2 wires. If it's sheep and goats, it goes 3 wires on it. But those 1 and 2 wire fences are pretty cheap to put in. So when we're laying something out, and this will depend on scale, that framework of permanent fence we put in, if we can keep those fences within a quarter mile of each other so that the corridors they create are easily divided with a single standard electric fence reel, which is a quarter mile wire, polywire.
Mm-hmm.
That is a convenient unit to work with. On a larger scale deal, where you're going to be putting up half a mile, 3/4 miles, a mile of polywire as you're doing these moves, that almost always will evolve to having a larger spool with a power winder on it. Usually it's mounted on a ATV, a UTV, or in a trailer that you tow behind something,
Mm-hmm.
so that you have the capacity to put out very long stretches of polywire. And it's not unusual now for us to have clients who are running 2-mile runs of polywire, for a 3 to 5 day grazing period, pulling it out, moving it on somewhere. They've just mechanized the process enough to the point that they consider it easy for them to do.
Sure.
Now, this 4,000 acre ranch that we started this piece of the conversation with, if that is a 40 AUD per acre productivity property compared to a 10 AUD per acre property, we're going to have different strategies of permanent and temporary use, because on the more productive land you can afford to put in more permanent infrastructure because it's got more animals there to pay the bills.
So some of the different maxims and quotes I've heard attributed to you would be, and one of them I heard live and in person on the Maya grazing webinar last week was that you started out saying, I think it was 2 weeks or something like that was a good grazing period, and now you're down to 3 to 6 days. Would you say that daily moves in a more arid environment are not generally profitable because you're not getting that recovery that you want, or can you make daily moves work just about anywhere, or how do you think about that?
We know some pretty large ranches that are doing daily moves, and they're doing it with a combination, and by pretty large ranches, I'll say in the 20,000 to 50,000 acre range, with the herd in question maybe being 2,000 pairs or something. And when you're doing daily moves at that scale, it's either mostly by herding or a combination of fence and herding. None of those outfits that I can think of off the top of my head doing daily moves in a arid to semi-arid environment are doing it with fence alone. There's probably some people who are doing it that way, but most of the outfits that I've worked with, it's a combination of strategically placed permanent fences and then herding. Now, the herding is very interesting way. This is going back to the way a lot of the American West worked pre-1900. And some of the outfits that I know who are doing it, they primarily started doing it for wolf management, having a 24/7 human presence out there. And with commercial cattle, the numbers that I hear bantered about is you need a minimum of 800 animals to justify the labor cost of herding. So obviously, if you go to 1,000 head, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 head in a herd in these vast semi-arid landscapes, it becomes increasingly affordable to do that. The gals doing it tell me that it really takes no more labor to run a herding program on 800 head than it does 200 head.
Sure.
Now, with 2,000, maybe you need more riders than you do with 800. I don't know about that.
Right. Yeah, it comes down to stockmanship at that point. I mean, as far as the 200 to 800, it's stockmanship, and the principles are going to work the same with 200 as they do with 800. At least that's kind of what I would assume they're getting at. Another maxim I recently heard attributed to you was a water tank or a water point on every quarter will pay for itself in X amount of days or years, I guess. Is that, I mean, water is kind of always the challenging part of grazing, I think. And so do you see, is that accurate, or am I repeating that correctly?
It's close to accurate. Now, that doesn't mean a water tank placed at the center of every quarter section. A water tank placed at the center of a section, so it's servicing 4 quarter section pastures, that will get, I think, about 80% of the grazing area within about a half a mile of water. Might be a little less than that, I'm not sure. And will it pay for itself? We come right back to, well, what's the productivity of land? If the base productivity is 6 animal unit days per acre, no, it's probably not. If the base productivity is anything above 20 animal unit days per acre, we're going to get a pretty quick payback on it. But it also, where are you starting from? If our starting point is we have a 4-section pasture, 2,640 acres that has 1 water point on it, putting 4 more water points out there is going to make a huge, huge difference in grazing distribution and carrying capacity. If we already have 6 water tanks out there, adding 4 more isn't going to give us near the economic response as from that first scenario that I described.
Sure. So in that scenario, if you had 6 water tanks, would you say combine them all into one herd and place them maybe around a quarter, or graze 4 paddocks around each water point, and then move on to the next one? Would that be a good strategy?
Absolutely. We have a really, really nice client example from Sandhills in Nebraska, where when we started working with this ranch, I believe they had 18 pastures. Now, they didn't rotate a herd through 18 pastures. They had 18 pastures set stocked with 20 to 50 cows per pasture, because each pasture had a windmill in it, and the herd was, for that pasture, was determined by how much water could the windmill in that pasture provide. Very few of their pastures were actually stocked based on the grazing capacity of that pasture. It was based on how much water can we get in this pasture. And so we put initially it was like 7.5 mile pipeline project in. It ended up being over 9. And those 18 pastures, and we designed the water system for the capacity of 800 cows and herd. This ranch had been carrying 400 cows. We designed it for 800 cow capacity, rotating through there. There was one really, really good well on the property, and so that's where the pipeline originated, and it went everywhere. So I forget how many new tanks were put in. I'll say 15, 9+ miles of pipeline, took the 18 pastures, subdivided it into 65, roughly 65 paddocks with 2-wire electrified high tensile fence. So this was a little over 8,000 acre property. We did this on. The cost per acre for all the fence and water development was only about $35 an acre. In 3 years' time, they doubled their grazing capacity on that ranch while watching blowouts heal up, grass growing back in. The dad on the place is 70-ish, and certain native grasses that he couldn't remember seeing since the 1960s, they're showing up all over the ranch again. So for an investment of $35 an acre and the ability to go from set stocking with 18 little herds to MIG they actually run two herds there, because they do a custom graze stocker herd and then their cow herd, I think. Yeah, $35 an acre basically bought them another ranch and made the ranch they already have heal up and get better.
Very good. I appreciate that. And Jim, I appreciate your time today. What do you got coming up? What's keeping you busy? What links can I put in the show notes page for today? workingcows.net/145.
Oh, wow. You can, of course, put a link to our website and the services we provide. In terms of upcoming events, I had a couple of 2-day schools canceled in May, a 3-day one in June. Those have all been pushed back later in the year. We're getting things rescheduled. We're coming back online. I know I've got I'll throw some dates out there. September 9th and 10th, Uinta County, Utah Soil and Water Conservation District, doing a 2-day workshop with them. On the 12th and 13th of September, Bossier Parish, Louisiana. We're doing a 2-day program there. I've got a 3-day school coming up in late August in the Western Sandhills. We'll have our Lost River Grazing Academy with the University of Idaho, September 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, I believe it is. So we've had kind of a blank calendar for the first 6 months. Well, the first 3 months of this year was jam-packed. But I have been at home for 3 straight months, which it's the first time in the 16 years since we moved to Idaho that I've been here for 3 months. And I'm not going away for another almost month.
Yeah.
So
well,
it's been amazing.
a well-deserved break. So I thank you for your time, and we'll have. I imagine there's an updated list of events on the American Grazing Land Services website.
We haven't updated it because 2 of the things that I just talked about has just been in the last 2 or 3 days that we've reset those dates and got them confirmed. But yes, if you go to our American Grazing Lands website and click on the upcoming events, pretty soon we'll have them all back listed in there.
Okay. Sounds good. There will be links to all that at workingcows.net/145. Jim, thanks for your time today.
You bet, Clay. It's been a pleasure to visit with you again.
Coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to talk to Chris Stelzer. We're going to talk to him about increasing forage availability on your place and how do you do that. Looking forward to that. Again, be a nice fit together with this one. So tune in next week for episode 146 of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.
And I'll tell you the reason for that is my daughter's coming June 30th through July 7th. And one of the big things is shooting ground squirrels. And they're all out on the flood ground. So I got to get all the cover off of the flood ground to make the squirrel shooting easier.
Perfect.
We make adjustments in our grazing management for strange reasons sometimes, but that's an important one.